are effective for the marine litter plastics cannot just involve a focus on waste at sea. They must involve attention to the origins of the waste, the upstream, the extraction, the production and transport, and so forth in the various stages of the life cycle of plastics. Each of the stages of the life cycle of plastics has implications for human rights. If we think about and look at questions of extraction of the primary materials on plastics, issues of impacts on indigenous peoples, for example, local communities, they have been documented widely around the world. Questions of impacts of production, the impacts on workers that are exposed to hazardous substances in the production processes, the transport of plastics or the transports of the primary materials of plastics, the loss of containers and nurdles at sea, and they end up affecting coastal communities. Oil spills, we've recently been all shocked by the oil spill off the coast of Mauritius, for example, with a Wakashio vessel. But it's not just extraction, production, and transport. Users, children that play with toys that have been infused with additives for plasticity or flexibility. And then, of course, there's the waste dimension, the abandoned containers in ports, the mislabeled cargo, the outright criminal activity, and also the north-south dimension of what is truly a global environmental justice issue, the dumping of plastics generated in the global north in the countries of the global south. The impacts of life cycle are severe. These are well documented. It is not an overstatement to say that the threat of plastics is a threat to the human species. Microplastics have been found in the placenta. There's uncertainty as to the consequences of this. Scientific research is ongoing, but where there's less uncertainty and where there's warning from scientists is that the chemicals added to plastics that have an impact on the endocrine system are reducing steadily the average sperm count. This has broader impact on biodiversity, but it puts in peril the ability of humanity to reproduce. This has been well studied, given funded studies on humans. So in a way, there's a bit of irony there that humans now have become the canary in the coal mine, warning of a broader threat to the planet. But it is not all doom. There are good practices that we can identify around the world. There are national level bans, for example, on single-use plastics. These are expanding. There are other measures that countries are taking. That said, plastics is indeed a truly global threat that requires global solutions. So to speak about the various dimensions of plastics and human rights interface, to address, for example, how the UN guiding principles can help tackle this threat, to analyze what are the opportunities to inject a rights-based approach that can really force transformation in the way that humanity is addressing this global threat. We have a stellar panel. I will mention your names and introduce you now. We have, first of all, Vishvaya Sambath with the environmental health, with the Chennai Climate Action Group in India. She's an environmental health researcher and campaigner with this group. Welcome. We also have Georgina Lloyd. She's regional coordinator for environmental law and governance with the UN Environment Program's Asia Pacific Regional Office. And then we also have Hemantha Withanaj, executive director with the Center for Environmental Justice in Sri Lanka. Welcome each of you, and we're very quickly now going to give the floor to Vishvaya. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Marco, for the setting up of the platform. And I am Vishvaja Sambath. I am based out of Chennai. I volunteer with a youth group called as Chennai Climate Action Group. And today we are here speaking about plastics and its pollution and its impact on human rights. I would like to share my screen now. Okay. As mentioned by the moderator, plastic is not a problem when it becomes a plastic. It also causes a problem when it is in its formation stage or even before it takes its shape. That is, from the extraction phase of the raw material, it is considered to be very problematic. And today I'm going to speak about the connection between ports, plastics, and pollution, and how it is impacting the human rights. So to begin with, I would like to introduce you all to a initiative called as Sagarmala. Literally, Sagarmala means Sagar means ocean or sea, and Mala means garland. So the Indian government has adopted an initiative to enhance the coast-based development, that is port-led development, to enhance the country's logistics sector. And the main strategy for this is constructing new ports and connecting them with and exploring the waterways without able, that is unexplored or unlocking the waterways is the main idea behind this project. So as we see here, we have lots of nodes. That is 14 coastal economic zones are identified by the government of India. These today we are specifically going to see about this zone which is in the southernmost area, that is Chennai, Ennore and Kattupalli is coastal economic zone. The current status of this zone is the Ennore Manali industrial area. So this is the India map on the left side of the screen. Ennore Manali is located in the southern part of the country, and the current status of this region is it is overfilled with industries. I have shown only few industries here, whereas there are 35 red category industries. This categorization is done by Central Pollution Control Board of India, which has more pollution and based on the capacity, and it is given color categorization. So the red category, 35 red category industries are located here. And the if you take a closer look on the image that is on the right side, so the upper half of the map is fully fossil fuel based, that is coal based thermal power plants are located, fly ash ponds and cold storage yard, etc. Whereas if we compare the lower half of this like map, we can note that it is purely like petroleum or natural gas based industries that is situated here. So this area is already having a petroleum hub or natural gas based hub. To intensify the problem existing in this area, so another proposal is being made here. So now this Kattupalli area is situated in the Ennore Mandali industrial estate. So as we see on the right side of the slide, this Kattupalli region is also called as island. Why? Because as we know, this region is surrounded by water bodies on all four sides. That is, on eastern side, Bay of Bengal, on western side, a river, and on the northern and southern side, the opening of the river into the sea makes it as an island. Already, if we have a look at there, we have two functioning ports that is existing there, which handles fossil fuels and petroleum or natural gas related products. Mm, this region is also rich in its biodiversity in terms of it has a mangrove forest, it has sand dunes, which helps in the inland from extreme weather events, for example, floods or cyclone landfalls, etc. And there is also a bird sanctuary which is located to this landscape, near to the landscape. So, there are more than 200 species of birds that makes a visit to this area during the migratory season. To erase or to disrupt all the beauty and the integrity of this ecosystem, there is a master plan being proposed by Adani Group. So it is mainly to expand the already existing port, which we saw in this. So the northern port, which is being expand. Okay, the proposal is there. So the total area required for this the proposal is 6,100 acres, and out of which, if we see the proposal, the 2,000 acres of land is going to be reclaimed from the sea, that is Bay of Bengal, and in on the western side, if we take a look, the red color boundary. So if we take a look, it is more than 3,200 acres of land, which is going to be water bodies and the surrounding floodplains. It is going to be converted into industrial estate. Uh, what is the matter here to even discuss about this in this session? Why? Because the sport is going to focus only on mainly on fossil fuel imports and export, as well as LNG, CNG, and other petroleum products exports and imports. So there's a proposal for 70 million tons per annum handling of liquefied natural gas and coal handling in this port. So the project cost is about 530 billion Indian rupees. So as I mentioned here, the if we have a look at this map, all these structure or all these infrastructure is placed on water bodies and also surrounding the land. Okay, so there is also a proposal when we are going to import tremendous amount of coal or liquefied natural gas or the raw material, there should be facilities for amplifying the use of these raw materials, and hence there is a proposal to develop a polymer industrial park in this region. So when I said before, we have already 35 red category industries located in a short span of landscape. So why is there a need even for introducing another highly polluting industry in this locality? So because the answer is Chennai is considered to be one of the largest automobile hub in the country. So when this polymer industry comes into existence here, it will feed into the automobile industry in the surrounding area. So surrounding area, when I mentioned surrounding area, this area is also having another proposal, developmental proposal for industrial area in this locality, which will mainly focus on automobile industries, electronic manufacturing industries, and hardware manufacturing industries. So for all these, plastic is like specialized or specialty plastics is very important for manufacturing these industries. So hence they are considering for developing this. So it is not just the plastic itself which is causing problem, but also the life cycle, the entire life cycle of plastic is a problem here. So as I mentioned here, this landscape is protecting the inland from land use change, for example. So this landscape is protecting the inland from extreme weather events, for example, floods. The river on the western side of the Kattupalli Island helps in draining excess water that is stagnated or flows in from the inland during monsoon season and drains it into the ocean, and hence prevents the inland from flooding. The contrary side of it is during drier season, during summer season, when there is water scarcity, the excess water that was drained through the water body will also refill or recharge the groundwater table in the surrounding area. So during drier season, we will get water from that the floodplains or the surrounding area. So this act, when the land use is being changed or converted into or encroached upon, this results in land use change, resulting in various disasters or extreme weather events, vulnerable for extreme weather events. So climate change, like these ports are also considered to be inducing or facilitating coastal erosions and risking the livelihoods, because people here depend upon the natural resources that exist in that area. It is not one or two livelihood that is existing here. There are thousands or hundreds of livelihoods that is existing here, which once a port like Adani Meha port comes into existence in this region, it will eradicate all the livelihood and the integrity of the ecosystem in this area, and making the people and other life forms vulnerable to future disastrous events like climate-induced disasters or extreme weather events. So at the end of the day, once the plastic is manufactured, and it will also result in microplastic contamination into the ocean and affecting the aquatic organisms and entering into our food chain as well. So this is what the entire thing is about. So before even saying that banning a product, it is very important to address the problem from its source. So rather than removing the cause of the problem, it is very difficult to stop the overflowing of the water. So thank you. These are the various livelihoods that is existing in the locality, few of the livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vishvaya, for your presentation. It clearly brings out the interconnectedness of the various issues that are involved in the plastics life cycle. The question of port expansion, shipping, the impacts on local communities, the question of land use, and significantly that of greenhouse gases and climate change. Perhaps adding a note to that, it has been estimated that the fossil fuels and the emissions caused by the production of plastics amount to more than 4% of carbon dioxide globally. That is a significant number at a time where also scientists are warning that we do need to drastically change course in order to safeguard the climate system for our present and future generations. Your presentation also brought out very clearly the issues of vulnerability for local communities, for coastal communities in the region, and more generally in the maps that you showed. This is a very important dimension of a rights-based approach, the focus on people in vulnerable situation and looking for solutions that, as you mentioned, cannot simply look at the end of pipe at the bottom of the line. They need to go upstream in order to be effective and address the causes of the problems. Otherwise, we're going to not really solve them. So thank you very much. At this time, I would want to point out that the audience can ask questions. There's a way to do that. If the technical facilitator could take the mic and explain what is the process for that, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Thank you. So if you're using a Windows device or a computer, on the bottom panel of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A button. If you click that button, there's a way to type questions in for you. And if you are on a mobile device, you will see a similar banner towards the top or somewhere that has the Q&A function. And you can type your question there as well.
Thank you very much to our technical facilitator. We're very much looking forward to receiving the questions and having an interactive dialogue on these issues. We will give each of our two remaining speakers the 15 minutes that had been allocated to them, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So next on our lineup, Georgina Lloyd. Georgina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marcus. So to start, we're going to actually play a short video, and then after the video, I will start my presentation.
Plastic pollution poses a big problem, but not only to the environment. From source extraction to waste, the existence of plastics hinders the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, affecting natural resources and the health and rights of communities around the world. For example, this is Yvette. She lives in a fishing village near an estuary. Her family has always depended on the ocean and its resources, but recently, a plastic manufacturer has settled upstream. Pollution from the factory may cause flooding, impacts tourism and fisheries, contaminates seafood and water sources with microplastics, and overall has negative repercussions on human rights. Every step of plastic production, when unsupervised, can impact the health and human rights of communities like Yvette's, which lack the power to influence planning stages. Try to imagine the stress and anxiety the parents of these children suffer, being exposed to plastic-related toxics. These marginalized communities, living next to polluting industries, are more susceptible to inequalities. Health issues compound education disparities. Moreover, waste picking is considered a woman's job, even if their bodies are impacted disproportionately, further exposing girls like Yvette to sanitation issues. As fisheries are polluted, fishermen, like Yvette's father, are forced to take jobs in production, gravely impacting their health with highly toxic materials. At the same time, the lack of political will and financing delays the development of circular economies, recycling and collection infrastructures, and fails to properly address unemployment. Now, from an infrastructural standpoint, plastic is produced using highly contaminated methods. This commodifies natural resources for profit and hinders the improvement of cleaner energies. Coupled with insufficient regulations and penalties, this hampers the development of sustainable communities, while complex recycling systems burden individual consumers and local authorities abdicate their responsibilities. From an ecologic standpoint, plastic production drives climate change through the emission of greenhouse gases, threatens marine wildlife, and aggregates contaminants through bioaccumulation and ocean acidification. It also affects life on land, as most microplastics and plastic waste output remain on land. Industrialized countries ship their plastic waste to poorer nations, and facilities are built mostly in minority communities, like Yvette's, threatening strong institutions and undermining justice and stability. In all, plastic pollution prevents the reduction of inequalities. But there is a silver lining. We are presented with a chance to create equitable collaboration opportunities to address plastic pollution at the global scale, to help strengthen the voices from impacted countries and come up with real solutions.
So now I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. So thank you very much again to Mathos for giving me the floor. And I just want to mention before I start that colleagues of mine in the regional office, particularly Natalie, and also colleagues in Nairobi in our head office, particularly Angela, have been instrumental in supporting the development of this presentation. And I want to start with a statement from the recently released UNEP and UN Human Rights Brief on Human Rights and Hazardous Substances. Pollution is the largest source of premature death in the developing world, causing approximately 3 times more deaths than HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. Pollution disproportionately affects persons, groups, and peoples in vulnerable situations, as Carlos mentioned, reflecting both historical and ongoing discrimination, racism, and power imbalances that have given rise to powerful social movements for environmental justice. And here, as Carlos said in his introduction, when we're talking about hazardous substances, we're talking about all toxics and wastes that have adverse effects on human health and on the environment, starting from their manufacturing and transport to use, trade, and eventually disposal. These can have enormous impacts on the enjoyment of fundamental human rights, such as rights to life, to attain the highest standard of health, to food, to clean water and sanitation, to housing, and of course, the right to a healthy environment. In addition to environmental harm disproportionately impacting individuals, groups, and peoples already living in vulnerable situations, including women, children, poor, ethnic, sexual and gender minorities, migrants, indigenous peoples, older peoples, and persons with disabilities. We also know that COVID-19 has exacerbated these already existing inequalities. And coupled with the triple environmental crisis, which includes not only pollution, but climate loss and loss of biodiversity, which also were, those interlinkages were explained in the last presentation. The poor and marginalized are among the most impacted by both COVID-19 and environmental harms that threaten the full and effective enjoyment of all human rights. Of course, including the adverse effects on access to food, on access to land, on housing, on livelihoods, on decent work, healthcare, and other basic necessities. COVID has shown us that the health of people and the planet are strongly interconnected. And while, of course, our immediate priority is on protecting people and limiting the spread, we still need to reflect on where we go next. The pandemic has not been a silver lining for the planet. The crisis requires a sound environmental response. It requires a response that recognizes the imbalances of impacts that are felt particularly on certain populations. It requires a response that is inclusive, just, gender responsive, and sustainable. And we can see that one of the adverse consequences of COVID-19 has particularly been the sudden surge in the volume of plastic waste, particularly products used for personal protection and healthcare purposes, but also as a result of an increase in use of online shopping and the food ordering services. Also in the Asian region, recyclers have faced with a 50% drop in the demand for recycled plastics and a 21% drop in the sale prices of recycled plastics. The volume of plastic collected and sorted by the informal sector has dropped by an estimated 65%, affecting, once again, the most vulnerable workers in the value chain. UNEP is working to address particularly these issues around plastics, COVID, and environmental response and overall recovery. Through COBC and Sea Circular, which is a project in our region, UNEP is providing technical expertise on chemicals and hazardous waste management, including analyzing the impacts of COVID-19 to help address the increase in waste that has been necessitated by the medical crisis. The UNEP Law Division has also prepared guidance on integrated waste management in the times of a pandemic. UNEP is also trying to support member states to build back better or build forward better, to capture opportunities for green investments and sound management of hazardous medical and single-use waste, while also seeking to protect the health and livelihoods of those that are impacted by the virus and the pandemic response measures, including the urban poor and informal waste pickers. We're also collaborating in the regional office with partners, and I see that Sarah Seck is on the call, and Dalhousie University and Sarah are one of those partners that we're partnering with in this year to develop materials on human rights and plastics, to build capacity of duty bearers to address the ongoing injustices. Of course, in this forum, we understand that human rights and the environment are intertwined, that human rights cannot be enjoyed without a safe, clean, healthy environment. And sustainable environmental governance cannot exist without the establishment of and respect for human rights. The interlinkages between human rights and the environment have been recognized in binding legal instruments at the global, regional, and national scales. However, there is still a need to build this knowledge and awareness amongst many duty bearers, and indeed amongst many rights holders, particularly around the impacts of plastics and pollution in general on human rights. Marine litter and plastic pollution, of course, is a major environmental problem. It's detrimental to marine life, to human health, and to coastal ecosystems, As we heard, they fuel tourism and fisheries industries. The unsustainable use and management of natural resources and waste, and the resulting decline in services provided by ecosystems threaten the full and effective enjoyment of human rights. We've also spoken a little bit about how the transport of waste, the treatment of waste, and indeed the production of plastics can also impact human rights. And we saw that also in the video that was just shown. So human rights and environmentally sound development are intrinsically linked. We have substantive livelihood rights, well-being, and health that depend on a safe environment, while procedural rights enable public participation in decision-making and access to information about developments that might impact the local communities. The human rights-based approach to plastics that Carlos mentioned seeks to address these underlying causes of the discriminate impacts of pollution and environmental degradation on vulnerable groups. It aims to empower and engage these groups in participatory processes and helps to build the capacity of governments, plastic producers, polluting industries, and other duty bearers to act and protect human rights in the environment. Some specific examples that we can use to clarify this, and that were also alluded to in the video, are things such as women who have different roles and are differently impacted by all stages of the plastic life cycle. As consumers of plastic products, particularly cosmetics and household goods, women have increased exposure and are also, though, likely to be champions for mitigating plastic litter in the household and in coordinating with formal and informal waste sectors. Informal waste workers, many of which are poor women and children, play an integral role in supplementing inofficial formal waste management and recycling systems, but they themselves are exposed to the impacts of the plastic waste. And coastal communities and people who depend on fisheries and aquaculture are also under a particular threat. We've seen that marine plastic litter significantly affects the health and lives of people living along coasts. And I've shared in the chat box a particular briefing note that was developed by the Sea Circular project that looks and delves a little bit deeper into these human rights-based approaches for preventing plastic pollution. I've also shared in the chat a link to the key messages on human rights and hazardous substances that was developed by OHCHR and UNEP, as well as a link to the video that you just saw. So I also want to talk a little bit about a recent study that UNEP has commissioned. And this is a study that is going to be released in late March or early April. This study explores in greater detail the links between environmental justice and plastic pollution. It provides recommendations for a number of different stakeholder groups, including business and countries and others. I saw that there was a question already about how to engage business, and engaging business is fundamental. And indeed, many of my colleagues working on the Sea Circular project, as well as our collaborations this year, are really going to focus on engaging with the private sector and building awareness of stakeholders in the private sector on human rights-based approaches and plastic pollution. So this particular report clarified that plastic pollution, of course, not only impacts the health of land and oceans, but impacts the health and well-being of people everywhere, every day. It also reinforces that it disproportionately impacts people living in vulnerable situations. For example, plastic pollution presents a challenge to both the No Poverty and the Zero Hunger SDGs, by threatening the livelihoods of those who depend on marine resources for work, and by polluting seafood that people depend upon for sustenance. Achieving SDG 5 on gender equality in countries where waste picking is considered a woman's job will require addressing women's higher exposure to waste and sanitation issues, work-related injuries, and the indirect health effects. In some cases, the SDGs are affected at different stages in the plastic life cycle. And this is evident from the extraction of fossil fuels, where the primary materials from which plastic is made and the microplastic bioaccumulation in marine wildlife that interfere with SDG 14's aim to sustainably manage and protect the marine ecosystem from pollution, and also to address the impacts of ocean acidification. Also importantly, the study positions plastic pollution as a social justice issue. This is something that was also alluded to previously. But we don't often hear about plastic pollution as a social justice issue because environmental justice is still not customarily considered within the marine conservation field. Current efforts limited to managing or decreasing plastic pollution are inadequate to address the whole scope of the problem that plastic creates, especially as we were talking about the disparate impacts on communities affected by the harmful effects of plastics at every point, from extraction, production to waste. And it's evidence that we have much to learn about the full impacts of plastics on human health and the environment, but it's imperative that we need to act swiftly and that we need to ensure that the actions we take employ a human rights-based approach. There's a significant market and regulatory changes to curbing our dependence on plastics and also to protect the lives and livelihoods of those who are most exposed to their impacts. But this report does outline a series of recommendations. It does identify recommendations for local, national, regional, and global stakeholders. They're targeted towards industry, government, and non-government, and consumer stakeholders. There are guiding principles to achieve environmental justice in the plastic industry. And some of these include ensuring vulnerable communities inform environmental conservation on the impacts of plastic waste. Addressing
Georgina, can I alert you that there's only 1 minute left for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. I'm just wrapping up. So also addressing the specific needs of marginalized groups and moving towards an environmental conservation movement that prioritizes the needs of those who are disproportionately affected by pollution around the world. The second set of recommendations is aimed at countries. And countries are tasked with an enormous challenge of developing and implementing effective policies to address plastic management. So in this process, they must be deliberate and cautious, integrating the best available science on the sources and impacts of plastics, incorporating environmental justice principles, applying precautionary principle to protect communities from potential risks, and things that we don't currently know about the impacts of plastic pollution. So all of these recommendations can be found within the report. In South Asia, just in conclusion, to highlight that there have been a number of specific activities that we've done, engaging with those that support environmental rule of law, as well as supporting those who enforce, that try and seek to deter and disrupt the illegal trade in waste across the enforcement chain. And finally, to finish, I just want to leave us with some key messages. And I'm happy to share these key messages so that they can be used and explored further by all of the participants in this session. But just to say that environmental human rights defenders play an important role in upholding and implementing and advancing the environmental rule of law and protecting those who are vulnerable to environmental harm, including from plastic pollution. Thank you very much, Marcos. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Georgina, for your presentation. It is very encouraging to hear that the UN Environment Programme is working on and is about to publish this report on environmental justice and plastic pollution, and that one of its key messages is that a human rights-based approach is essential for the kind of responses that are needed to address the global plastics threat. I would also echo the points, a couple of the points that you made in terms of the interconnection between the global plastics threats and the attainment of the sustainable development goals. As those discussions at the time of the elaboration of the SDGs unfolded, the role of human rights was seen critical, underlining the articulation of those SDGs. So there's an important point there. The point that every step in the way towards plastic can impact on human rights is also very powerful. It evokes the image that everything that we do to the environment, eventually then we do to ourselves. So there's that indirect interconnectedness. But your presentation also fleshed out the direct impacts on various human rights out of plastics in its whole life cycle, whether it's the right to life, the right to health, the right to water and sanitation. This publication that you mentioned by UNEP and the Office of the High Commissioner on Hazardous Substances and Human Rights, it also speaks to the great relevance of the right to science. And here, the evidence of the plastics threat is clear. And so the imperative to act is also clear. One more thing I'd echo from your presentation are the figures that you mentioned on recycling. Recycling has been put forward as a solution, but evidence is indicating that at this time, at least, it is a false solution because the infrastructure and capacity does not exist because of the failure to internalize the true costs of production of the raw materials of plastics upstream, and also because individual discipline and responsibility is not a substitute for the range of policies at the state level and at the global level that need to be established in order to address this global threat. So thank you again for your presentation. We may come back to you to elaborate further on the point that that was raised by the audience on how to engage, how to actively engage banks, financiers, the private sector, and businesses. You mentioned that there's UNEP is looking into this. It would be useful to get further elaboration on the how part of it. So we'll come back to you in due time. But at this time, I'd like to give the floor to Hemantha Withanach, Executive Director, Center for Environmental Justice, Sri Lanka. Hemantha, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I'm from Sri Lanka. My organization is Center for Environmental Justice. I heard many times the previous speaker talk about environmental justice. So probably this time, so I may be sharing what we have done in our country. I want to share my screen here. This is about the repatriation of the post-consumer waste containers. So we found in Sri Lanka, which came from the United Kingdom. You can see where the Sri Lanka is located and how many ships are moving next to Sri Lanka. So and they all come from the East and Southeast Asian past and going going around the Indian Ocean. And these are we don't know how many ships are carrying these plastic waste or the post-consumer waste, but some of them and many of them landing in Sri Lankan harbor. So in 2019 we found a story that the Customs Department and the Central Environmental Authority, which is the agency responsible for environmental conservation in Sri Lanka, in the industries actually. So they found containers. It's originally they say 130 containers, but lately they found altogether 263 containers. These 263 containers were found in 3 different locations. And the real importer is a small businessman, but there is a big corporation, big business behind this whole shipments. We found that in the third world, in the developing countries like Sri Lanka, so getting them prosecuted is a serious issue. So we thought that the government agencies might not do the legal action against these companies or this violation. So, and we thought that they will dump them somewhere, as in some of the previous cases, we found that they have dumped or burned so those waste containers, and which will violate the human rights. So therefore, we decided that, so we want to file the legal action, and we can file the legal action against the government agencies, which is called a writ petition. So during the court case, the court of appeal requested the government analyst department to investigate what is in these containers. So they failed. I think this is a very good lesson for all of us, because they said they don't have necessary gears and equipment to open these suspected containers, and they're not ready for that. And they thought it could have some viruses or something which could which would contaminate them. And also from the few containers they have opened, they found plastics, waste carpets, mattresses, and many other items from some hospitals. So by that time they have already unloaded half of the containers, and we found that with the rain, so they washed all the waste, and it goes through the drains to the waterways. So initially they found 263 containers, but lately they told that there are suspected containers, another more than 1,000. So they're abandoned in the harbor. So we don't know what they contain, because they have not yet opened. But what they have unloaded, we found various kind of mattresses and things like the scrap metals in this waste, with a lot of microplastics here, and these are the ones washing into the waterways near the pre-trade zone, which is called Katunayaka, very near the Colombo airport. So luckily we found certain way bills. So these are the ones they issue when they are doing the shipment. So in these ones, we found that they have brought so much of we found this about 12 of these kind of way bills, which is many tons. We don't know how exactly, but in this particular bill it's about 171,000 kilograms altogether. So it's a huge amount. And also this is another shipment. So and from these bills and receipts, we found who are the one responsible. So that was the basis for our case. In 2019 July, so we filed the writ petition against importing all these clinical waste from the UK. And but same time, the Central Environmental Authority, which is the environmental agency in Sri Lanka, and also the Basel focal point, so they communicated with the UK Basel focal point, and both countries have agreed that they will take it back. But because the court case is there, so they were not able to take it straight. So, and also because of the COVID situation, they were not willing to come here. But so they sent an email telling the court that they are ready to take all of them back. So after this development, so we were asked to withdraw the case, because if there's a court case, so they cannot take it back. Because the containers are already or the subject matter to the court. So therefore, if they want to repatriate, so we had to withdraw the case. So we withdrew the case based on two conditions. One condition is they have to repatriate all the waste containers back to the origin, because what we have asked is not to dump anywhere, but to repatriate everything to the origin. The second case we asked is to file the legal action against those who violated the law. I think we have about 4 businesses, and 2 of them are huge businesses, And here we are talking about the business and human rights. So the businesses are really in violation of the national laws and also violation the human rights. So so the initial 112 containers were repatriated and using 5 different ships, but part of the containers still in Sri Lanka. And yesterday I was told by one of the customs department officers that another 20 will be repatriated this week. And also they are waiting for the ships to repatriate maybe another like 100 containers. But I also monitored where these ships are moving actually. So I saw, so they are going through the Suez Canal. So then I wanted to make sure that actually those ships are really taking these containers back to UK, because I found these some of these ships were touching India. And I thought maybe India, so they were touching the very industrial harbors. Maybe I thought they will be dumping there. But then I have alerted some of my colleagues in India as well to keep an eye on this. But so they really moved from to the UK. So I think this simple examples gives a message to all these dirty businesses and some of those countries who are sending their waste, either post-consumer waste or the plastic waste, so that the laws can really make them accountable, and they can also get a bad name, because these companies have we got a very bad name because of this issue. But I know that in Southeast Asia, including Sri Lanka, we have many other ways these kind of plastic waste and post-consumer waste are coming. I have seen some of them in Malaysia and Philippines. So I think this is just one simple story, but I think that we can use the national laws and the proper implementation of the Basel regulations to make sure that so we send them back to the original situation. But one thing we want to be very clear: Sri Lanka has not properly made the regulations in order to get the proper Basel situation in Sri Lanka. So therefore, I think the national laws, arranging national laws to make sure that we can properly implement the Basel Convention is a very, very important. And also to identify the investigate what is in these containers is also a problem. So we don't have the facilities. So we have to make sure that if you are not sure what is inside those containers, we have to find a way that you block at the entry point, not to bring them to the country. So that's all I have to share. Thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Thank you very much, Hemantha, for elaborating on this case study. It is no doubt of significant gravity, minded to reflect that the north-south transfer of hazardous substances, and in this context you mentioned clinical waste, medical waste commingled with plastics, all of which begins to form hazardous substances. This has been on the international agenda and radar for decades now, at least since the mid-1980s. It led to the negotiations of the Basel Convention on transboundary movements of hazardous wastes and their disposal, which is significant because it regards illegal traffic as a criminal activity, and it obliges parties to take penalties as appropriate. So we're not faced with a minor human rights concern. We're faced with criminal activity that back 25 years ago, the UN Human Rights Commission recognized as having severe human rights implications. And for that reason, among others, it established a dedicated mandate on toxics and human rights. That mandate was later on expanded from its original focus on hazardous wastes to address the life cycle of chemicals and wastes. But it cannot be lost that the global environmental injustice apparent in the dumping of wastes generated in the north, in countries in the global south, is continuing and is posing continuing threats to the enjoyment of human rights. I would make that point at the outset. The second thing I would echo from the case study that you mentioned is on the perils of downstream waste. You mentioned dumping, which already puts pressures on ecosystems and on people's lives. But then also burning, you mentioned, and air pollution, the number of people that every year suffer from a premature death out of air pollution is staggering. On the specifics of burning of plastics, this is often also presented as a solution, the incineration of plastics, but it also has been regarded as a false solution because the technologies are such that dangerous contaminants are released to the environment, such as dioxins and other harmful contaminants. So there's that dimension as well. Another point I would echo from your very clear presentation is that businesses have the responsibility to comply with the law. That is the basic baseline upon which the legal framework is established. From there, the UN guiding principles elaborate more clearly and more extensively on due diligence and other duties of businesses in respect of human rights. But at a minimum, there is that compliance with the law. But then there are questions that arise, as you well pointed out, when the laws are themselves inadequate. And in this instance, the Basel Convention adopted certain amendments on the trade in plastics, and yet the implementation of those amendments in national law, we're seeing a quite a disparate formulations in that process of implementation, and it is not always the case that the laws are sufficiently robust as they should be. That said, the Basel Convention remains an important point, and I think one question that comes to mind in the case study that you elaborated on is on the compliance committee of the Basel Convention. Was it at all available? Could it be used? There are limitations for civil society groups to initiate a case in that committee, but it is a committee that is tasked with overseeing implementation and compliance of the agreement. The last point that I will echo from what you've laid out is on the question of labeling container content and the mislabeling that seems to be a rampant practice. Who's taking responsibility for that practice? As you may know, I'm conducting a visit to the International Maritime Organization, and this problem has been identified as one of the concerns that is leading to potential impacts downstream when the contents of containers are lost to sea, or when the content of containers can pose a threat at the point of destination. So that's another big element that I think warrants attention, as you rightly pointed out. So thank you very much for your presentation. At this time, we have about 25 minutes for a Q&A. And so I would invite the audience to post their questions on the Q&A chat. We've already received a couple of them. A couple may be quite straightforward and easy to answer. There's an attendee that asks, where can we download the new UNEP study that was mentioned by Georgina on environmental justice and plastic pollution? So Georgina, as you take the floor on that, perhaps you can come back to the earlier question on how can the private sector and businesses be actively engaged in initiatives to deal with plastics. And after you will come back to other questions. Thanks. Georgina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcos. So the first question, indeed, it's fairly simple to answer. Right now, you can't download the study because it's going to be released at the end of this month. So after March, you will be able to download it. It will be available on the UNEP website. So we'll make sure, of course, that it is circulated as soon as it becomes available. In terms of the second question on the role of private sector and business and how to engage also banks and financiers in responsible business practice, this is a very good question. Through various initiatives, UNEP is engaging different private sector stakeholders. So through the Sea Circular project I mentioned before, they're particularly engaging with the hospitality and the food and beverage industry, looking at medium enterprises and larger enterprises to try and engage those industries in their use of plastics throughout their value chain. Some of that starts with knowledge and awareness and capacity building. So developing very simple knowledge products that put the human rights language into business language, because the terminology that is used in the human rights world or even in the environmental sphere can be quite foreign to the business world. So sort of translating these principles and these issues into documents and into very practical measures that businesses can implement. Also drawing upon the UNGPs, the UN guiding principles. And the UN guiding principles set out one of the core measures for private sector, and that is their due diligence responsibilities. And this is something that Marcos mentioned. And we're engaging also through UNEP FI, which is our finance initiative, engaging with banks and financiers to look at the role of due diligence also in investments and undertaking risk analysis that incorporates environmental risks before they determine how and where they are going to invest. We've also started engaging, and this is not very well developed, but we've started engaging with banks around the shipping industry as well. Particularly, the banks are looking at shipping as, again, risk factors, and particularly looking at the illegal trade in waste and how those banks can, of course, it's a risk for them, but how can they better identify and undertake due diligence so that they are more informed to be able to intervene and take a responsible position. Also in the shipping industry, again, looking and engaging with large shipping companies and freight forwarders as well, and seeing what responsibility they have in ensuring that the illegal trade in environmentally sensitive commodities is deterred and disrupted. And indeed that the criminal penalties that are very clearly elucidated through the Basel Convention, and particularly following the implementation of the Ban Amendment this year, it's very clear now that much of the trade in hazardous waste that is covered by the Basel Convention is no longer allowed from OECD to, depending on the OECD country status, but that covers a large amount of the shipping from Europe, particularly, to countries in our region. And so it's very important to start engaging with the shipping industry for their role in that. So UNEP is not really fully developed in many of these initiatives, I have to say. You know, there's a lot more work that will be done, but we're starting to engage a lot more with the private sector, particularly around due diligence responsibilities and how to implement the UN guiding principles. Thank you. Back to you, Marcos.
Thank you very much, Georgina, for elaborating on that question. We're receiving questions on the Q&A chat. We're taking written questions at this time, And there's a question that talks about, I'll read it. Considering the clear human rights abuses caused by plastic use, do the panelists consider fast-moving consumer goods companies complicit in those abuses, considering their heavy reliance on plastic? Samantha, could I come to you on this question? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting question. So in fact, we are really looking the other side, because in Sri Lanka, when you not have access to the poor for certain goods, the people explain that as a human right violation. So that's why they convey the message that giving a small sachet packet like 20 milligrams, 20 milliliter, things like that should be still available for those people who can afford that much from the market. But in fact, the people don't understand how those are violating the human rights. On the other hand, by destroying our food chain, destroying our water, destroying our the air, with the microplastics and all. So people don't get much information from any of those scientists or from the agencies looking after that side of the story. So even the academics research are very limited in many of our countries. Now in Sri Lanka, so we have already have the laws starting from April 1st actually, to ban all the sachet packets below 20 milligrams or 20 milliliters. Then also we are going to ban all the inflatable toys and the cotton buds where they are using the small plastic, as well as using PET bottles for chemical filling. So we are going to ban. But this has raised some issue. And few years back, actually about 12 years ago, so we brought a legislation to have a conservation levy on each plastic bag which they are buying from the market. Then somebody immediately went to the Supreme Court asking that so when he buy goods from the market, he should have access to a bag free of charge. So then court agreed that that is true, and the court say so you have to reverse this decision. So in fact, the Consumer Affairs Authority have to come up with a new gazette saying that there will be no charge to the plastics bag. So they put this as a human rights angle, but because at that point nobody intervened, saying that having those plastics bags, in Sri Lanka we monthly use 45 million yogurt cups monthly we dump. 20 million shopping bags or the plastic bags we just dump. 15 million lunch sheets we just dump into the environment. So people don't bring the human rights angle of this dumping, and because we don't have much research available. So I think this is a very good question. Now, if we while we are talking about the other side of where the businesses are bringing that they don't want to do the human right violation by not having access to the poor, but at the same time what they are dumping is a human right violation. So I think making enough information available, documents available, good arguments available will help us to bring that aspects as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Hemantha, very much for elaborating on those dimensions. There was indeed a specific question on specific regulation on plastic sachets in the upcoming market. So that's been answered. There is a question that I'd like to put for Vishvaya, but Vishvaya, are you active with us still?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. So thank you. The question for you is, is on how your advocacy is integrating human rights issues in respect of business responsibilities. Thank you for elaborating on this.
Thank you for the question. And so, uh, at present, rather than seeing the advocacy part, which addresses or creates awareness among the general public in their usage, it is very important to educate or pass on the information to the business people or the business sector, that they have to be responsible enough, because as I mentioned earlier, rather than going and trying to invest our energy in sorting the issue at the end of the pipe, it is very important to address the issue at the source. So closing the tap is very essential. So here, in order to control this, especially the plastic pollution, or the plastic pollution, it is very important that the business world is well educated, or advocate educated enough to take action, necessary measures to move away from the fossil fuel based thing. And this will not just sort the issue of plastic pollution, this will also address the other sustainable developmental goals of UN, because we are also in general addressing for or advocating for moving away from based fuel to renewable fuel, to reduce our carbon footprint, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and reducing the climate change. So it is very important that business world is well educated and moving away from the plastic production. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Visvaya, for elaborating on that. There's another question on the Q&A that says, and I'll read it, by when Asia will be closed for dumping of waste, including plastic waste of developed countries, and who will close this unhuman behavior? Hemantha, could I ask you to take a first stab at that? Thanks.
So when we file the case, many people ask why you oppose. My simple answer was that Asia is not the dumping ground for the Western countries. We have to do this. I mean, it should be immediate. It should be now. But unfortunately, because of the poverty situation in our countries, because the businesses are not respecting to the laws, because of the bad governments, because of the corruption, and there are many other reasons that this is continue to happening. But at the same time, many of our countries are also using single-use plastics heavily, unnecessarily, and people don't understand the impacts. Now, in fact, about few years ago, one of the World Bank report suggested that Sri Lanka is the 5th nation dumping plastic to the ocean. We have a lot of debates about this number, but still I think Sri Lanka is significantly dumping, but it cannot be much higher than either Indonesia or Philippines or some of those Southeast Asian countries. What I'm going to say, the national consumption of plastic and dumping them into our oceans is also a major issue. But to solve this thing now, for example, Sri Lanka just brought a waste to energy plant, and the finance ministry, I mean, the national treasury is paying burning plastics and generating only 10 megawatt. So and now, so they have already found, I mean, this was started only 2 months ago, but the treasury has already found this is a white elephant now. So they are promoting a few more waste to energy plants in our part. So that's how they are going to resolve this issue. But they're not thinking about the circular economy in the country, and this is not going to be successful. These are poor solution. I think so. We have to have a good educated politicians and also the government decision makers if we want to make this real. So while we are opposing, because what happened in 2018 when the China decided that no more importation of waste, so then only all other countries start receiving so much of garbage. So we were not ready with our policies by that time. So I think that now the countries have realized now we have to do more and more policy changes, and also so we have to educate our own people if we want to do this thing. At the same time, I think the developed countries also need to do things, because they still think that so what are their ways when they give it to the recycling, actually it's going for the recycling, but without going recycling, they're bringing them to the developing countries and dump somewhere. So the consumers in the developed countries doesn't know this thing really. So I think we have to educate those the people in developed countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hemantha, for elaborating on that. If I could add 2 points to what you've clearly articulated. One is that on the responsibilities of exporters. So it's one thing to look at imports, right? But what is the responsibility of exporters? And there, as has been mentioned by one of the panelists previously, the Basel Ban Amendment has already entered into force. For those who may not be familiar with this amendment, the question about a ban on the export of hazardous substances from the OECD countries to the non-OECD countries, so the rich countries of the world dumping their waste in the poor countries of the world, that was very controversial at the time of negotiations of the Basel Convention. Shortly after entry into force, one of the first COPs, Conference of the Parties, adopted this amendment, but it took many years for the amendment that bans the transfer of hazardous wastes from the global north to the global south to enter into force. It is now in force. And so now it is also a question of monitoring of the kinds of procedures that may be available to ensure compliance and to secure accountability. So that's, I think, a very important point that you've put on the table on the responsibilities of exporters. We have 10 minutes left in our program, and before we move, and I give the floor to the panelists for any closing arguments, any closing comments that they may want to, and you may want to present. There's also the question that is presented on what is the UN Environment Programme doing to share lessons in the region, such as the ban on single-use plastics. What kind of regional forums are available for regional discussions on plastics that could presumably tackle in a tailored manner the specific challenges of plastics in the region? Georgina, could I come to you on this question? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So we have one regional forum that has been held for the last few years. It was hosted first by Thailand and last year by Vietnam, and that's Sea of Solutions. It's held every November, and the entire purpose of Sea of Solutions is to share ideas, to bring private sector, CSOs, international governments, international governmental organizations and governments together to share ideas and explore solutions to address marine pollution and plastic pollution more broadly. So that is the core forum that I would share.
Thank you very much, Georgina. There's, I think we have time for one last question, and it speaks about the costs of and the dilemmas, the balancing of economic growth and plastic pollution. It speaks about, for example, how consumers in developing countries may not have the ability to spend on sustainable products and manage waste effectively, finding appropriate solutions. Is this an unsolvable dilemma? That's the question posed. Do any of the panelists wish to take this? Should I call on anyone? So as we can see from the silence of our panelists, this is a very big dilemma. The balancing of economic growth and environmental protection is often framed in the context of sustainable development. The reference to the SDGs previously speaks to how these issues can be reconciled. But at the same time, the fact that we're speaking about human rights and documenting the impacts of plastics in its life cycle on human rights begins to draw a baseline. So solutions must build on that baseline, and the kind of balancing that can take and should take place between economic growth and technology and social development and so forth must be such as to respect human rights. So in a way, inviting now the panelists to take the floor for a couple of minutes, closing reflections, observations that you may have. Perhaps we'll start in the reverse order of the presentation. So Hemantha, will first go to you, then Georgina, and then Vishvaya. Hemantha, you have the floor.
First, let me thank for giving me this opportunity. I think so. This is just a little bit about the whole this iceberg. So it's a huge issue. And yesterday I was in a plastic committee in the government. It's a government committee. So we realized that the issue is really bigger issue because we have this doubt about whether we can do the whether we can control this plastic pollution not having much impact to the economy. I think what my understanding is that when your economy, your GDP based on the plastic and the toxic, the fossil fuels, etc., it's toxic GDP. So now, so if you don't understand that this GDP is not going to be really sustainable, so then definitely, so the countries will have to face major expenditure to resolve those health issues, environmental issues, cleaning the soil, cleaning the rivers, etc., etc. So I think we just need to realize. But unfortunately, every time when we want to ban, now for example, now there are questions about whether we have the regulation to ban single-use plastics. Every time people ask, what is the alternative? I think we should not do that. I think because before the plastics come to the scene, we had enough things, and we had clothes and other natural products, etc., etc. Now, if we ban certain things, at least the most possible things, so definitely people will look for alternative. But if you just wait for the alternatives to ban these things, so it will not happen. So I think at the same time, I think we have the only way we can control these importation and the control in the businesses is that having a good legal regime. So unfortunately, many of our countries are not ready with these legal regimes. So therefore, I think we have to support, we have to produce the model laws, model policies for the developing countries to control these plastics. At the same time, I think if there's a single window mechanism, which when you send all these waste containers, and the receiving end, you should know what is in the container. So I think this kind of information making is possible with this digital era and with all these agreements we have signed internationally. So I think we are not using them very well at this moment. So I think so we have a lot of policy regulatory changes, but I think the people's attitude change is very much important, because that's the way you can reduce your waste load. So I mean, it's all good for both developed and developing countries. People's attitude is very important. Otherwise, we will not be able to resolve this kind of issues even in the future. Thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Thank you very much, Hemantha. And human rights can definitely help to build and increase, enhance that awareness for action to be taken. Georgina, on to you for 2 minutes closing observations.
Thank you very much, Marcos. I think in the closing would be that to solve this issue, we need to address the environmental justice concerns. We also need to address the environmental rule of law. It's something that the last speaker just referenced, that we need to have good laws, we need to have good enforcement implementation of those laws. We also need to not forget that one of the major factors in this issue of the pollution and the life cycle of plastics is environmental crime. And environmental crime is estimated at $91 to $259 billion annually. And so in order to address the issues of plastic pollution, we also need to address the concerns around environmental crime. Thank you, Marcos.
Thank you very much, Georgina. And so very quickly on to you, Vishvaya, for the sake of time. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. So I have a couple of points. First thing is when we speak about the cost effectiveness or less expensive material, considering plastic to be, it is very important that we think about the amount of energy or the resource or the money that we invest in tackling the problem that is being posed because of plastic, and the expenditure that goes on for health impacts that is resulting out of plastic use, or the microplastics and the contamination, etc. That is first thing. And second thing, it is very important that in addition to the contribution or the efforts taken by the individuals or the community, it is very important that there is a political will, strong political will in curbing the plastic pollution. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vishvaya. We're right on time. This discussion has been very rich. If I could wrap a couple ideas up, the relevance of human rights to the global plastics threat is certainly a driver for action. It should propel us all to take action, but not only that, the design of action, the kind of response needs to follow a rights-based approach. And that's where a focus on the most vulnerable, that's where securing access to information at every stage of the life cycle of plastics, that's where effective monitoring and reporting, and that's where accountability and access to remedies all play a role in the design of the kinds of measures that need to be taken in order to address this global threat. I want to thank the organizers of this session. I want to thank the panelists for their interventions, and I wish to thank all of you in the audience for your attention and your engagement. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next opportunity to be with you all. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.